with his back against the San Francisco traffic, on the bridge's side that faces towards the jail, setting out to join a demographic. He hoists his first leg up over the rail. A phone call's made, police cars show up quickly. The sergeant slams his passenger door. He says, "Son, why don't you talk through this with me? Just tell me what you're doing it for." Oh, it's a little bit of everything. It's the mountains, it's the fog, it's the news at 6 o'clock, it's the death of my first dog, it's the angels up above me, it's the songs that they don't sing. It's a little bit of everything. There's an older man who stands in a buffet line. He is smiling and he's holding out his plate. And the further he looks back into his timeline, that hard road always led him to today, making up for when his bright future had left him, making up for the fact his only son is gone, and letting everything out once his server asks him, "Have you figured out yet what it is you want?" I want a little bit of everything, the biscuits and the beans, whatever helps me to forget about brought me to my knees. So pile on those mashed potatoes and an extra chicken wing. I'll have a little bit of everything. Somewhere a woman is writing her invitations to a wedding she has scheduled for the fall. Her man says, "Baby, can I make an observation? You don't seem to be having any fun at all." She said, "You just worry about your groomsmen and your shirt size, and rest assured that this is making me feel good." He said, "I think that love is so much easier than you realize. If you can give yourself to someone, then you should. 'Cause it's a little bit of everything, the way you joke, the way you ache. It is getting up before you so I could watch you as you wake. So on that day in late December, it's not some stupid little ring. I'm getting a little bit of everything. It's a little bit of everything. It's the matador and the bull. It's the suggested daily dosage. It's the red moon when it's full. And all these psychics and these doctors, they're all right and they're all wrong. It's like trying to make out every word when they should simply hum along. It's not some silly little message written in the dark or some truth that no one sees. It's a little bit of everything. It's It's a little bit of everything.
That was a beauty, Avi. Good morning. I ask for your indulgence. I'm getting over a cold that refuses to let me go. I think you know that kind of cold. The reading today is from 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life by Karen Armstrong. Has anybody ever read this or know of this book? We have one. Good. Karen Armstrong is probably the foremost writer of religious history that is around today. She's written a dozen or so books, such as biographies of Muhammad and Buddha, the history of God, and a number of other books. I guess I've read about 5 or 6 of hers. And to put this reading into context, she's talking about how it is difficult for we humans to show compassion because of our evolution. Our evolution has made us very defensive and wanting us to protect ourselves at the cost of others sometimes, and makes us sometimes, perhaps many times, only think of ourselves. There's no doubt in the deepest recesses of their minds, men and women are indeed ruthlessly selfish. This egotism is rooted in the old brain, which was bequeathed to us by the reptiles that struggled out of the primal slime some 500 million years ago. Wholly intent on personal survival, these creatures were motivated by mechanisms that neuroscientists have called the 4 F's. Feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction. Those who have persistently trained themselves in the art of compassion manifest new capacities in the human heart and mind. They discovered that when they reach out consistently toward others, they are able to live with the suffering that inevitably comes their way with serenity, kindness, and creativity. They find that they have a new kind of clarity and experience, a richly intensified state of being. The 4 F's are powerful. They can overturn all of our efforts to live more kindly. But we are thinking beings with a fully developed neocortex and have the ability to take responsibility for them. Our perilously divided world, compassion is in our best interest. To acquire it, however, we need to demand an immense effort of the mind and heart. Gandhi memorably said that we must ourselves become the change that we wish to see in the world. When I think of compassion, two names come immediately to mind. One is Jesus of Nazareth, and the other is Siddhartha Gautama. Now, you may not be familiar with that second name. You may know him better as the Buddha. The Gospels are full of examples of what Jesus allegedly said or did to show us how we should treat each other. And I say allegedly because the Gospels are notoriously inaccurate. But whether they're accurate or not, the idea behind them is still valid. Unfortunately, too many people go right past those passages in which Jesus is showing compassion or talking about compassion or teaching about compassion. And they go right to what I call the smoke and mirrors, the walking on the water, the changing water into wine, and all that stuff. Or the people will cherry pick various aspects of Scripture to justify their own prejudices. According to Matthew, when Jesus traveled to teach and preach, he said, "You saw the multitudes and was moved with compassion for them because they were weary and scattered like sheep with no shepherd." Later in Matthew, Jesus is shown to be reaching out to the people on the fringes of society, which he did routinely during his ministry. And this included, of course, people who were transgressors of church doctrine. And in one passage in Mark, it says, he talks about the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were sort of the establishment of the Jewish religion back when Jesus was in his preaching era. And Mark writes, "The Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners, and he eats with them.'" Oh my God. You know, far too often, many people, including people who call themselves Christians, want to look past that. They look away from people who are in need because it's uncomfortable or it doesn't fit in their ideology. How many people who call themselves Christians would vote for or support policies that shred the safety net for people who are poor or sick or undereducated? I applaud Pope Francis's effort to refocus Christianity on the compassion of Jesus. But people still don't get it. A couple years, well, I guess a year and a half ago, the Pope was in Philadelphia. And before he came, he sent out a press release, or his office did, to say where the Pope was going to be visiting, schools and hospitals and things like that. And one of the places he was going to visit was a prison. And I remember a letter to the editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer that said, "Gee, couldn't he visit someplace else?" And what this person didn't understand was that that's exactly what Jesus did. Jesus visited the prisoners and the sick and the lepers and all those people who are on the margins of society. I can tell you he wouldn't be ringing the bell on Wall Street to the opening of trading. I can tell you also wouldn't be having lunch with a televangelist either. Compassion is also a central tenet of Buddhism. I've read a lot of stuff about the Buddha and stuff by the Dalai Lama. And in one of the Dalai Lama's books, he says, "Compassion is a mental attitude based on a wish for others to be free of their suffering and is associated with a sense of commitment, responsibility, and respect toward others." Some of you may know the history of the Buddha. He was born into a wealthy family, and his father wanted to protect him from all of the things that weren't so nice on the outside world. And he actually tried to physically restrain him from experiencing what was going on in the outside world. But he couldn't do that, and eventually the Buddha, Siddhartha at that time, made his way outside and looked around. What he saw was a time of upheaval and disillusionment and anxiety. This was an era called the Axial Age, which was a period of great upheaval and spiritual disillusionment, not only in India, but in many parts of the world. And he saw this, and he felt a great deal of compassion for people in that situation. And those people were looking for someone who they referred to as an enlightened one, someone who could lead them out of this disillusioned spirituality. And so Siddhartha Gautama became that person. He became the Buddha. In Buddhism, according to the Dalai Lama, compassion is based on a premise that all human beings have an innate desire to be happy and overcome suffering just like myself. And that's a real key there, that you have to think of the other person just like you are. On the basis of that recognition of this equality and commonality, you develop a sense of affinity and closeness with others. One of the things that makes me think of is sometimes you'll get angry with somebody you don't know. But if you knew that person before you got angry at him, you might not be angry or as angry because you knew that person. Compassion literally means to suffer together. And it's often confused with empathy and altruism. And there is some commonality among those three. Empathy means to feel the suffering or understand the suffering of another. But it stops right there. Compassion takes the next step to try to alleviate that suffering. Altruism means doing good works, but it doesn't necessarily have to be based on compassion or on empathy. And let me give you an example. You probably saw in the paper a few years ago 2 billionaires from Philadelphia who gave a little over $300 million to 2 medical schools, Thomas Jefferson University and the University of Pennsylvania, which are now the Kimmel Medical College at Jefferson University and the Perelman Medical College at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, of course, these were generous gifts, and they're going to result in some good works. But I don't consider them to be compassionate. Altruistic? Yes, but not compassionate. Why? Because I think if you took that $300 million and gave it to the Philadelphia public schools, which were, and still are, much more in need of that money, and coincidentally, the Philadelphia public school deficit is around $300 million, that would be more compassionate. And I say that as a person who not only lives in Philadelphia, but has been a tutor in the Philadelphia public schools for 15 years. And I've seen how things have deteriorated and how much that money could help. One of the biggest proponents of compassion today is Karen Armstrong, from whose book I just read. And she says this about religion in general. In her research, she found that across the board, religion is about behaving. Instead of deciding you believe in God, you first do something. You behave in a committed way, and then you understand the truths about religion. She says that you only understand the doctrines of religion when you put them into practice. And first and foremost of those practices, she says, is compassion. You know, a lot of people say, I believe in this, and I believe in that. Okay, what are you going to do about it? Armstrong says, in every one of the major faiths, compassion, the ability to feel with the other, is not only a true test of religiosity, it is what brings us into the presence of what Jews, Christians and Muslims call God or the divine. It is compassion, the Buddha says, that brings you to nirvana, or at least closer to it, because, as Armstrong says, in compassion we feel with the other. We dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another person there. Then we see the divine. Now, even for an atheist like me, that resonates. And for me, I don't think of the divine as being some supernatural entity, but the best in all of us, our highest calling, what we are meant to be as human beings. In 2008, Armstrong won the TED Prize. Does anybody know what TED is? Have you seen any of the stuff? A lot of great stuff on YouTube of TED lectures, originally designed to be about technology, but they're much more widespread. And her acceptance of her TED Prize is on YouTube, and I urge you to see it. And with the money she got from this prize, $100,000, she started the Charter for Compassion, which urges people around the world to embrace the concept of compassion. And she created a website called charterforcompassion.org. And on that website, and in interviews that I've seen of her, she says that compassion impels us to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures and to honor the sanctity of every single human being, treating everybody, without exception, with absolute justice, equity, and respect. If that sounds familiar, it's part and parcel of our UU principles. And if you distill that into a single sentence, I would say it would be, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which we have come to know as the Golden Rule. A lot of people think that the Golden Rule has roots in Judeo-Christian religion, but in fact, it was promulgated by Confucius, who lived about 500 years before Jesus. And Confucius told his disciples to show compassion all day, every day, which is pretty much of a tough order. And I don't think it's something that we could relate to. But he said that if you did that, you'd reach a state called Hren, H-R-E-N, which is a transcendent experience of goodness and benevolence. The virtue of virtues is what Confucius called it. Unfortunately, compassion, like many other good qualities that we're supposed to have, is hard. It's hard to show compassion for somebody you don't like, for somebody who has done harm to you or your family. Even in some cases when that harm might be minor. We like to hold on to that grudge or that anger. And a good deal of that has to do with what Armstrong said earlier about our reptilian brain that we still have there somewhere, that makes us want to defend ourselves against all attacks or all perceived attacks. It's also more difficult today to show compassion because we live in a pretty screwed up world in a lot of ways. And part of that screwed up world is that a lot of people in major religions have hijacked those religions with extremist views. We've seen plenty of examples of Islamic extremism, people who will do barbaric things in the name of the Quran. But we've also seen, we know from history, that Christianity is certainly not blameless, and we've also seen a lot of Christians who are perfectly willing to judge others because they don't conform to a certain lifestyle that they think is the perfect lifestyle or the lifestyle that Jesus or God wanted. One very important part about compassion is that you can't confine it to just your people. You can't confine it just to the Unitarians or just to the liberals. You know, Jesus talked about loving your enemies and honoring the stranger. I remember a quote from Wayne Dyer. You remember Wayne Dyer, pop psychologist? I used to listen to his tapes all the time. You remember tapes, don't you? And one of the things he said was, you know, it's easy to be nice to the people who smell good. And I think he meant that literally and metaphorically. And even people whose ideas we despise or whose actions we despise are deserving of compassion. And on this aspect, I'm reminded of the Amish. You remember about 10 years ago, someone massacred 10 Amish school children in Lancaster County. Just no particular reason. He was just crazy. And the Amish families went to the parents of this young man and showed their compassion for his parents. And let these parents know that they understood and sympathized with their situation. The golden rule in compassion also applies to nations as well. Nations should not do unto others things that they would not have done unto them, and the reverse. But how often do we see this violated in our own country, the United States of America? How often do we claim that we're the home of the free and the land of the brave, and, you know, our system is perfect, and then we try to overthrow dictators we don't like, or democratically elected leaders we don't like, Chile being an example. Actually, in Iran, that person was also democratically elected, and they knocked him out and put the Shah in. Or we lie and go to battle in places like Iraq or Vietnam. Or we prop up dictators like Somoza or Batista in the name of fighting communism. So, compassion is a good thing, right? How do we get there? How do we lead or start to lead a more compassionate life? Well, one way to do that is with this book, which has the appropriate title of Start Where You Are. It's written by Pema Chodron. Anybody know Pema Chodron here? I can see a few hands. Good. She is an American Buddhist nun. I didn't know such a thing existed until I heard about her several years ago. And she writes in her book that compassion has two meanings. The first meaning is that you have to be compassionate toward yourself first. So when you start on the road to compassion, you have to start with yourself. She writes, "It is unconditional compassion for ourselves that leads naturally to an unconditional compassion for others. What you do for yourself, you do for others. What you do for others, you do for yourself." She gives an example of people who think that they're getting back at somebody only to realize, or perhaps never realize, that they're really hurting themselves. And she uses this example of somebody who picks up hot coals with his bare hands to throw at somebody who he's angry with. And he may or may not hit that person, but for sure he's going to burn his own hands with those hot coals. Compassion also means realizing kinship with all beings, not just human beings. The Buddha, or the Dalai Lama, refers to sentient beings, which includes animals, and which is why most, if not all, Buddhists are vegetarians. However, I think you can be a compassionate person and still eat meat, for example. My wife and I had tried over the last several years to only eat meat from animals that are humanely raised, and we sometimes go to great lengths to do that. And fortunately, more and more products are available to us, even in major supermarkets, from humanely raised animals. And the one thing that I always keep in my mind is a quote from a farmer who I interviewed for a story that I did for Wine Spectator 15 or 20 years ago. And it was in Westchester County. We were living in New York at the time, and I drove up to this farm, and it didn't look like a farm. It looked like an animal spa. And all the creatures were kind of roaming around and having a good time. And so I said, "What's the story here?" And she said, "Well, our philosophy is that our animals will only have one bad day in their life." Now, you can imagine what that day is, but think about it for a second. How many human beings can say they've only had one bad day in their life? Now, the second meaning of start where you are is that you don't need anything special to start showing compassion. You don't need to change who you are or where you live or what you do. You don't have to have any special education. You don't need a certificate that says you are a certified compassionate person. You can just start doing it. Now, we Americans we're very goal-oriented, very achievement-oriented, and so we want to do things right and we want to get it done 100%. But the other thing about compassion is you don't have to get it right the first time or the second time. As a matter of fact, you don't have to get it right any of the times. You can just go out there and do it. Don't let perfection be the enemy of doing good. You don't have to do anything special either. You can just start by listening, which is something we males obviously need more work on, so our better halves tell us. And listening, when I say listening, I don't mean trying to give the person some solutions. Just listening. Maybe offering an example from your life, but mostly just listening. Armstrong's book doesn't give you anything new in the area of compassion, but it bears reading and rereading because, as Armstrong says, compassion is a lifelong project. It's not like Lent or Ramadan. You don't do it for a month and then you say, okay, now I don't have to be compassionate anymore because I was compassionate for 30 days, We need to be reminded over and over again that we need to be more compassionate, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, we're not bad people because we need to be reminded to be compassionate, or stupid people because we need to be reminded. And we shouldn't be daunted by Confucius, who said we should be compassionate all day, every day. That clearly is not something that's within most of our realms unless we decide to become monks. As a matter of fact, Armstrong says just the opposite will happen. She says, nearly every day you will fail. Nearly every day you will fail to be compassionate. Even when sometimes during the day you will be compassionate. Sometimes you will be angry. Sometimes you will be unkind. But that, again, should not stop you from trying to be a compassionate person. Because if you persevere and only show a fraction of the kind of compassion that Jesus and the Buddha talked about, the world will become a better place. And your life, our lives, will be well worth living. May it be so. Amen. Thank you.